Hello, I'm Sarah from Free Your English, where I help English learners turn their reading into real-world fluency. Today, we are reading a short but very powerful story called The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. This story is only a few pages long, but it raises big questions about freedom, identity, and marriage. Questions that were very controversial when it was written and are still relevant today. In the video, we will read the story, make sure that you understand it clearly, look at useful English vocabulary in context, and then use the story as an excellent starting point for some really good English speaking practice. The author was born in St. Louis, Missouri in 1850. When she was a child, her father died, and she was raised by her mother, grandmother, and great-grandmother. In the mid-19th century, most women were completely legally and financially dependent upon men. So growing up in a household led by women was unusual, and it was very influential upon her. She married young herself, had 6 children, but was widowed in her early 30s. After the deaths of both her husband and her mother, she fell into a deep depression, and it was her doctor who encouraged her to write as something that might help. And this marked the beginning of a very productive literary career. She was writing at a time when women's thoughts and emotions were rarely treated as serious subjects in literature. Her stories focus on women's inner lives and the limits placed on them by marriage and society. Well, those writings were something that really challenged social expectations and so often made readers uncomfortable. And as a result, she suffered a lot of painful criticism of her work. She's best known for the novel The Awakening, which caused controversy for its portrayal of a woman who is questioning her role and identity. That same focus on freedom and selfhood appears in her shorter work, including The Story of an Hour. To understand this story, we need to understand what life was like for women at that time. In 19th century America, women could not vote. Very few women were highly educated, went to college. Married women could not keep their wages. Divorce was extremely difficult, even in abusive marriages. And legally, marriage was not just a romantic partnership, it was a contract of power, and women had little power in that contract, even over their own body or even over the right of being a parent to their own children. The Story of an Hour by Kate Chopin. We are using a dyslexia-friendly font and background, and the text is my modern version. So I have changed some of the words and phrases just so that the English is modern and useful, and so that we don't get bogged down, i.e. stuck, in some of the old English. I will include a link to the full original version on my blog post. You can see the link in the description. It is roughly about a B2 level text, and we're going to start with some speaking practice. Here's a pre-reading question for you. There's actually 2 of them. First of all, what does the title suggest to you? The title being The Story of an Hour. Pause the video, have a think, and then speak out loud your response. Actually do it. It's really good for your English. Okay, so by focusing on a single hour, the title suggests a brief, intense story that explores thoughts and feelings rather than events. So if you said something about it's interesting that it is focused on one particular amount of time, that's great. If you said something different, tell me in the comments. I would love to know what you came up with as you were speaking about what you feel might be the significance of the title. Okay, one more question for you to practice speaking out loud. And imagine that you're sat with a friend and you're speaking, or you're sat in a classroom, and actually give yourself that chance to have that little bit of real speaking practice. What does freedom mean to you? Try to explain it using one example from your own life. One of the themes of the story, a theme being a big idea, is freedom. So before we read it, go ahead, pause the video, and answer that question. Knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted with a heart condition, great care was taken to break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. Her sister Josephine was the one who spoke to her, using broken sentences and indirect hints that revealed the truth while still trying to soften it. Her husband's friend, Richards, was there, too, near her. He had been at the newspaper office when news of the railway disaster arrived, with Brentley Mallard's name at the top of the list of those reported killed. After confirming the report with a second telegram, he hurried to tell Mrs. Mallard himself, hoping to prevent a less careful person from delivering the news. Mrs. Mallard did not react as many women do, with shocked disbelief or emotional paralysis. She cried immediately, openly and intensely, collapsing into her sister's arms. When the surge of grief had passed, she went alone to her room and closed the door behind her, refusing to let anyone follow. There stood facing the open window a comfortable, roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by a physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. In the street below, a street vendor called out about his goods for sale. The notes of a distant song, which someone was singing, reached her faintly, and countless sparrows were twittering in the eaves. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. She was young, with a calm, pale face marked by self-control and quiet strength. But now her eyes were fixed on one small patch of blue sky, her expression vacant and distant. It was not thoughtful reflection, but a pause, a moment where conscious thought seemed suspended. There was something coming to her awareness, and she was waiting for it, fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. But she felt it, creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. She was beginning to recognize this thing that was approaching to possess her, and she was striving to beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white slender hands would have been. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. Her pulse beat fast and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. A clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. She knew that she would weep again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked at her except with love, now pale, motionless, and lifeless. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. And yet, she had loved him, sometimes. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Louise, open the door. I beg, open the door. You'll make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I am not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. Her imagination was running riot along those days ahead of her. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. At last she stood and opened the door to her sister's desperate pleading. There was a feverish triumph in her eyes, and without realizing it, she carried herself like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Just then the front door opened. Bentley Mallard stepped inside, slightly dusty from travel, calmly holding his bag and umbrella. He had been nowhere near the accident and did not even know one had occurred. He froze in confusion at Josephine's sharp cry and at Richard's instinctive attempt to block him from his wife's view. When the doctors arrived, they said she had died of heart disease, of a joy too powerful to survive. Okay, now that we have read the story, let's do some speaking practice. What was the story about? If you're stuck, you might want to rewind, go and listen to the story again. You might want to think about who, what, where, when, why, and how, and just try and explain the steps of the story and what happens. So pause the video, go ahead and speak that out loud. Okay, so I've got a little bit of a longer explanation of the story for this one because it was a lot that happened. So the story of an hour is about a woman called Mrs. Mallard who is told that her husband has died in a train accident. At the beginning of the story, Mrs. Mallard is described as having a heart condition, so her sister and her husband's friend try to tell her the news gently. Although I don't know how you tell someone that news gently, because that's a very hard thing to hear. When she hears that her husband is dead, she cries immediately and shows strong grief. She is upset about it. She's very upset about it. After this, Mrs. Mallard goes alone into her room. As she sits quietly, she begins to notice the world outside the window, the sky, the trees, and signs of new life. And she's also kind of just in shock. Like she's paused. She's not thinking. While sitting there, she slowly realizes that her life will now be her own. She understands that she will no longer be controlled by marriage and begins to feel a strong sense of freedom. This feeling surprises her, but she accepts it and does not judge herself for it. Mrs. Mallard comes out of the room feeling calm and hopeful. However, at the end of the story, her husband suddenly walks through the door. He was never in the accident and is completely unaware of what has happened. When Mrs. Mallard sees him, she collapses and dies. The doctors say that she died from joy, but the reader understands that the shock comes from losing the freedom she had only just discovered. Whew. Okay, that's a big summary of the story. I would challenge you to write a one-line summary of it, because that will really test your English to think about how can you take all of those details and make it into one sentence. This is a story about, and then complete the sentence. Tell me in the comments if you managed to do that. Now let's move beyond what happens in the story, the plot, and let's consider the deeper meaning. The Story of an Hour is often seen as an important feminist text because it questions marriage as a social institution, and it shines a light on the loss of personal freedom that it could represent for women. The author is careful in how she presents that idea. She does not describe the husband as cruel or abusive. We are in fact told that he looked at his wife with love, and that she also did love him at times too. This makes the story, for me, a little bit more unsettling because it forces us to look more closely at marriage itself. Instead of criticizing an unkind or abusive man, the author asks us a more uncomfortable question. What happens when a person is loved but not fully free? And she uses irony to show this tension between love and freedom. Through the use of irony, she shows a huge gap between how women's experiences are explained by society and what they actually feel like inside. Before we look at how irony works in the story, let's briefly define it. A basic definition of irony is that it is a contrast between expectation and reality. So irony is when we expect one thing to happen, but what actually happens is different. For example, we expect a dentist to have healthy, well-cared for teeth. It would be ironic if in reality you met with a dentist with very dirty, badly cared for teeth, because that's not what you expect from a dentist, so it's ironic. There are two types of irony used in the story. Situational irony occurs when the outcome of a situation is the opposite of what we expect. So in the Story of an Hour, there is situational irony because Mrs. Mallard discovers a sense of freedom only when she believes that her husband is dead, which is a situation that normally society would expect to only bring grief. So the expectation was different from the reality. There is also dramatic irony in the story, and dramatic irony is when the reader understands something very important that the characters do not. Think about what we understand as a reader at the end that the characters don't. Tell me in the comments, can you explain what the dramatic irony is in the story? Okay, we're going to go through the vocabulary and do an overview of the vocabulary that's highlighted within the text. But I'll actually read the entire story again so that I can pause and talk about some of the aspects of the story that might not have been clear, and also some of the vocabulary that I'll just point out quickly rather than doing a deep dive into. Okay, so knowing that Mrs. Mallard was afflicted, i.e. she suffered with, afflicted with a heart condition, great care was taken to break to her, so that means tell her, break to her as gently as possible the news of her husband's death. So she's someone that's suffering from this heart condition that she can't have, big shocks. And then a heart condition is a physical issue, but also the heart is a symbol of emotion. Her sister Josephine was the one who spoke to her, using broken sentences and indirect hints that revealed the truth while still trying to soften it. So she's struggling to speak, and she's kind of pausing and taking it slowly and trying to soften it to make very difficult news seem easier to understand or to accept. Her husband's friend, Richards, was there too, near her. So this is someone that we immediately see has people that care about her. He had been at the newspaper office when news of the railway disaster arrived, with Brentley Mallett's name at the top of the list of those reported killed. So it was an official report. So it was, they had good reason to think that he had passed. After confirming the report with a second telegram, he hurried, so he went quickly, to tell Mrs. Mallett himself, hoping to prevent a less careful person from delivering the news. Mrs. Mallett did not react, as many women do, with shocked disbelief or emotional paralysis. Paralysis being frozen, so not being able to process anything. She cried immediately, openly and intensely, collapsing into her sister's arms. So I think this is important that we are shown that she did have a huge reaction of genuine grief. When the surge, so the big wave, the big powerful amount of grief had passed, she went alone to her room and closed the door behind her, refusing to let anyone follow. There stood, facing the open window, a comfortable, roomy armchair. Roomy means expansive, with lots of room, lots of space. So a roomy armchair would be a very large, comfortable, expansive armchair. And these vocabulary words are highlighted. They will be on the blog post with a full vocabulary breakdown of antonyms and synonyms and collocations and so on. So you can check the link to the blog post for that. So she sat in this roomy armchair. Into this she sank, pressed down by physical exhaustion that haunted her body and seemed to reach into her soul. So she just was so exhausted, she kind of just collapsed onto the chair. She could see in the open square before her house the tops of trees that were all aquiver with the new spring life. Aquiver is an adjective that's describing the trees as shaking, trembling in the wind, right? They're being blown about in the wind. It's very formal. We would use it for written English only. In spoken English, we would say the trees were quivering with the new spring life. So quivering, shaking, trembling. In the street below, a street vendor called out about his goods for sale. This is one of the words that I changed from the Old English, which I think said wares. His wares for sale. So just an example of one of the things that I changed to make it more modern. The notes of a distant song which someone was singing reached her faintly. If something can be heard faintly, it means it's at a low volume. You can only hear a little amount. So that singing arrived into her ear at a very low volume. And countless sparrows, it's a type of small bird, were twittering, kind of noise, in the eaves. The eaves are the part of the house that jut out past the wall. We often get birds' nests in there because the wall's here, the roof is there, and there's kind of a space there that is good for them to nest in. So she could hear the birds in the eaves of the house. There were patches of blue sky showing here and there. It's a good collocation, isn't it? Here and there. Through the clouds that had met and piled one above the other in the west, facing her window. She sat with her head thrown back upon the cushion of the chair, quite motionless, except when a sob came up into her throat and shook her, as a child who has cried itself to sleep continues to sob in its dreams. It's a good comparison, isn't it? A simile comparing two things that are not commonly compared. So she was as sad as a child who's kind of doing that sobbing that's involuntary. So again, that implies that that's an involuntary sobbing, that it's genuine grief and shock. She was young, with a calm, pale face marked by self-control and quiet strength. But now her eyes were fixed on one small patch of blue sky, her expression vacant and distant. Vacant means not occupied in a physical sense. So like a house that's vacant doesn't have anyone living within it. If you talk about a vacant expression, then we mean without thought. they are so shocked that they can't think, and they're just kind of frozen. So we don't use it usually to talk about someone's expression was vacant. We usually say they had a vacant expression. It was not thoughtful reflection, but a pause, a moment where conscious thought seems suspended. So she's just kind of frozen. There was something coming to her awareness, and she was waiting for it fearfully. What was it? She did not know. It was too subtle and elusive to name. So I think it's interesting how this kind of comes upon her, and she at first kind of wants to reject it and resist it. But she felt it creeping out of the sky, reaching toward her through the sounds, the scents, the color that filled the air. So it's personifying this thing is almost like a monster creeping towards her. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, so her body's having a big reaction. She was beginning to recognize that this thing that was approaching to possess her, so she feels like it's going to take over all of her. And she was striving to try. She was trying to beat it back, so she was trying to push it away, beat it back with her will, as powerless as her two white slender hands would have been. So just as her hands would be useless against a monstrous thing, her will, her desire to not deal with this, could not beat back this idea that was coming to her. And then she gives up trying. When she abandoned herself, a little whispered word escaped from her slightly parted lips. She said it over and over under her breath. Free, free, free. So she's almost shocked at herself. It seems to like just arrive upon her from nowhere, this idea of being free. The vacant stare. Okay, so that's another good collocation. So vacant expression or vacant stare. The vacant stare and the look of terror that had followed it went from her eyes. They stayed keen and bright. So her eyes are described as keen. Keen has two meanings. One, eager and enthusiastic. So you might talk about maybe someone was a keen worker or a keen volunteer. And then the second meaning is highly developed. And the second meaning is more in play here, more being used. That the author is saying that vacant stare, that vacant expression disappeared, and her eyes are focused and piercing, and there's an implied clarity of thought that has arrived. She's shifted from having a vacant expression where her eyes are not really looking at anything to a very keen expression where she's focused and her eyes are developed and intense. Her pulse beat fast, and the coursing blood warmed and relaxed every inch of her body. Coursing seems to be a word that I really only come across as collocating with blood, and it just means flowing through. So the blood courses through our veins, it flows through. She did not stop to ask if it were or were not a monstrous joy that held her. Monstrous meaning terrible, joy meaning happy. I mean, roughly, I'm sure you know that. I know you know the meaning of these words. I just wanted to point out how the author has juxtaposed them. To juxtapose means to place one thing beside the other to create an emphasis. So this is what we call an oxymoron in literature. We have two opposites placed together. So monstrous is like terrible and joy is wonderful. So they're very much contrasting, and that really provides an emphasis to how conflicted she is. That she is feeling grief, but she's also feeling this freedom, the joy. Clear and exalted perception. To exalt something means to lift it up, to raise it. So her perception has become raised and clear. She's shifted away from that vacant expression, and she's now like feeling like she's thinking clearly. So a clear and exalted perception enabled her to dismiss the suggestion as trivial. So she was wondering, oh, is this a monstrous joy? Like, is this a terrible thing to think this way? And then she dismisses that as trivial being unimportant. So she's not going to blame herself for feeling this. She's just allowing the feelings to come. She knew that she would weep again. Weep is a formal word for cry. So she knew that she would cry again when she saw the kind, tender hands folded in death, the face that had never looked at her except with love, now pale, motionless, and lifeless. So this is important, that it says that her husband had always looked at her in a loving way. So he had never looked at her except with love. So there'd never been a time that he'd looked at her with anger or hatred. So he was a good husband. He was a good man. But she saw beyond that bitter moment a long procession of years to come that would belong to her absolutely. So she's recognizing that she's on a bit of a roller coaster. She has these feelings of joy and freedom rising within her, but she knows that she has to deal with the funeral and that she will go into bitter grief. But after that, she knows that there's something else coming. And so she's thinking beyond the funeral and the grief and seeing a long procession of years. Procession is a word that we might use to describe a funeral. It means to walk in a large group of people in an orderly way, such as you would do at a funeral. So it's interesting that she would use that word procession. There's a mixture of sadness and joy in all of this. And she opened and spread her arms out to them in welcome. So she's finding herself excited about the thought of doing whatever she wants with her life. There would be no one to live for during those coming years. She would live for herself. There would be no powerful will bending hers in that blind persistence with which men and women believe they have a right to impose a private will upon a fellow creature. I think it's interesting that the author could very much have just said there would be no man forcing her to do what she didn't want to do. But this is a commentary on marriage in general, that both men and women often assert their private will, their own wants and desires on the other person, the fellow creature. So both men and women behave inappropriately sometimes in marriage, forcing other people to change their life or perhaps do things that they don't want to do. A kind intention or a cruel intention made the act seem no less a crime as she looked upon it in that brief moment of illumination. So she's thinking about marriage and saying, when you force another person to bend to your will, to do what you want, even though they might not want to do it, it doesn't matter if you're doing it to help them or out of love, you're still controlling, you're still forcing, you're still taking away their freedom. And yet she had loved him sometimes. Sometimes, so not all the time. It seems that there was a disparity in the amount of love that was between them. Often she had not. What did it matter? What could love, the unsolved mystery, count for in the face of this possession of self-assertion, which she suddenly recognized as the strongest impulse of her being? So she's being controlled by marriage that controlled every part of her life and took away all her power. And then now that power has come back, she can see clearly, it is actually important to have freedom and control over yourself. Free, body and soul free, she kept whispering. So I think that's important that the word body is included there, because this was a time in which women did not have control over their own bodies, over the decisions that were made around their body in many different capacities, nor did they have ownership of the children who came from their bodies. So she's speaking, for females in general, not just this one character, that without the marriage she will be free in so many senses. Josephine was kneeling before the closed door with her lips to the keyhole, imploring for admission. Imploring means begging, desperately asking for admission. She wants to go in, so she's desperate to get in and see if she's okay. Louise, open the door, I beg. Open the door. You will make yourself ill. What are you doing, Louise? For heaven's sake, open the door. Go away. I'm not making myself ill. No, she was drinking in a very elixir of life through that open window. An elixir of life is a mythical potion that is supposed to bring you magical things such as being able to live forever or being able to drastically extend your life. So it's often mentioned in literature as being like a magical potion that brings you extended life. We can use this informally to talk about something that we feel is very powerful in a healthy way. Say, for example, drinking a green smoothie in the morning is one of my elixirs of life. It's one of the things that extends my life and brings me great health. But mostly we use it in a kind of magical way. So she's not suffering and harming herself. She's gaining all of this like potential energy from thinking about how she's coming back to herself and back to owning herself. Her imagination was running riot along those days ahead of her. A riot is an act of extreme defiance that implies violence and fighting and disorder. But if you have an imagination, they collocate together, imagination and running riot collocate together. If you have an imagination that's running riot, it means it is exploding in ideas. It's a really good phrase to know. My imagination was running riot when I purchased my house and needed to decide how I was going to decorate it. So I had an explosion of ideas. So it's a positive thing for something to run riot in your mind, your imagination. So we can say your thoughts are running riot, or your imagination, or even your ideas. That means they're exploding in a kind of joyful way. So she has all of these thoughts about the potential for her life ahead. Spring days and summer days and all sorts of days that would be her own. She breathed a quick prayer that life might be long. It was only yesterday she had thought with a shudder that life might be long. So it's the first time that we really see very powerfully that she was suffering to the point that, she wasn't enjoying life at all. At last she stood and opened the door to his sister's desperate pleading. There was a feverish triumph. Feverish means that you have a fever, you are hot or ill, but it also can mean that you are kind of experiencing a huge amount of like energy and enthusiasm. So it's kind of crazy, a crazy triumph in her eyes. Without realizing it, she carried herself like a goddess of victory. She clasped her sister's waist, and together they descended the stairs. Richard stood waiting for them at the bottom. Just then the front door opened. Bentley Mallard stepped inside, slightly dusty from travel, calmly holding his bag and umbrella. So it's really interesting, the juxtaposition of like her in this moment of like intense emotion of like grief and joy, and then him in contrast, calmly entering. It's just a normal day for him. It's just another day. He's just arriving home. He had been nowhere near the accident and did not even know one had occurred. He froze in confusion at Josephine's sharp cry and at Richard's instinctive attempt to block him from his wife's view. So she saw him, she screamed. The friend tried to block her view, tried to make it less of a shock, tried to soften the situation. When the doctors arrived, they said she had died of heart disease, of a joy too powerful to survive. The Story of an Hour was unconventional and unsettling when it was published. It asked readers to take seriously a woman's inner life at a time when women weren't taken seriously. Women's freedom, legal, social, and personal, was very sharply limited at the time. And the author doesn't argue or loudly or directly about this. Rather, she presents a quiet moment, a private reaction, and irony to powerfully question what freedom really means. More than a century later, this still matters. In many parts of the world today, hard-won freedoms are being challenged or taken away, or they have yet to be instilled even. Reading and discussing stories like this remind us that freedom is not abstract. It is lived and felt, and sometimes only really recognized when it's threatened. From a language learning point of view, it's powerful to read interesting texts because it gives you something real to think about and respond to. Vocabulary, structure, just general fluency grows more naturally when you are trying to express a genuine idea that you are genuinely engaged with. I would love to know in the comments, what did you think of the story? What did it bring up for you? And if you would like more practice using reading as a way into clearer, more confident speaking, then I would invite you to join my Read to Speak book club. It's designed for thoughtful B2 to C2 English speakers who want to talk about what they're reading, organize ideas, and build real fluency through discussion. Also, check out this story-based video based on the open window if you would like more vocabulary-rich reading to work with next.